It was 50 years ago, before the main story started. In the church in the peaceful village, there was a young sister named Lucia, and she had always been a woman of deep faith and dedicating her life to serving the church in the peaceful village of Vespera. The villagers admired her gentle nature and the kindness that seemed to shine from her. But Lucia held a secret that was buried deep inside her heart, that no one knew, until it began to take over her soul. 50 years ago, Lucia had met a traveler named Adrian. He had eyes that sparkled with mystery and a voice that could charm anyone. One summer evening, he came to the village and brought with him a sense of excitement and wonder. Over time, Lucia and Adrian became very close, even though she had made vows to the church that should have kept her away from him. Lucia couldn't help but fall in love with him. It was a love so strong and so powerful that it felt like it could never be broken. But Lucia's faith and duty to the church were stronger than her love for Adrian. She knew her love was forbidden, and the weight of that knowledge crushed her heart. With a heavy heart, she told Adrian that she could no longer be with him. Then he left the village, and his footsteps faded away, and Lucia was left all alone. Her heart was broken, and everything she knew felt like it was falling apart. In her sadness, Lucia made a desperate wish. She called out to forces beyond her understanding, and hoped for Adrian to return, or perhaps to find a way to ease the pain in her heart. But her plea was answered in darkness, a darkness that changed her forever. Now, Lucia's soul was no longer her own. Bound by the pact she had made, she became a shadow of her former self. The gentle nun had turned into something else, something cursed to walk the earth for all eternity. Her spirit was trapped, and she wandered the church, and her mournful cries filled the night. Then, the church, once a place of peace, became a place of fear, where no one dared to enter, especially after dark. The villagers spoke of the nun who had sold her soul, and they avoided the church as much as they could. It was said that Lucia's spirit would watch from the shadows, and her eyes were filled with sadness and anger that could never be quenched. Now, no one dared to go near the church, fearing the curse that had taken hold of her. And so, the haunting began. The village of Vespera was left wondering, would the darkness ever end, or would Lucia's soul be lost forever? The sun set behind the horizon, casting long and eerie shadows over St. Christopher's Church. Now, the villagers talked about the church with both fear and respect, because after dark, the church became different. During the day, it was a place of peace. People came to pray, and hopes were shared in silence. But as night fell, a coldness seemed to settle over the land. Then, whispers spread through the village, telling stories of strange footsteps and ghostly figures that appeared in the church's windows and calling to those brave enough to enter. Father Benedict, the priest of St. Christopher's, was a man of strong faith, and he was determined to protect the church from the dark forces haunting it. But even he started to feel uneasy as the nights grew longer and more frightening, because strange things began to happen more often. Candles would go out on their own, and cold winds would blow through the church, even when the doors and windows were closed. The villagers avoided the church after dark, saying that Sister Lucia's curse had not only claimed her, but was now spreading through the walls of the church. The air felt heavy, like something dark and evil was watching. Some people said they heard cries of pain coming from inside, or saw a pale and shadowy figure moving through the pews. But Father Benedict had never believed in such things. Until now, he had spent his days trying to fight off the growing darkness. But as night came, a feeling of unease grew inside him. The hairs on his neck stood up, and the whispers of Lucia's restless spirit seemed to get louder. But he knew he had to protect the village, no matter what it cost. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Father Benedict stood at the altar, and his hands were shaking as he said the evening prayers. The wind howled outside, but inside, the church was quiet. Or so he thought. Then, a cold breath brushed against the back of his neck. Clare Matthews had always been fascinated by the mysterious and the unknown. As a historian of folklore and forgotten stories, she traveled from town to town, and she was uncovering secrets that others had forgotten. When she heard about the haunting at St. Christopher's Church, she couldn't resist the chance to learn more, because the village of Vespera, with its dark history and rumors of ghosts, was a place she had to visit. When Clare arrived, the villagers greeted her with fearful looks and quiet warnings. They were terrified of the church and its curse, and they warned, "Don't go near it after dark." Some spoke of the ghost of Sister Lucia, still wandering the church and trapped in endless suffering. Others whispered that the curse had spread through the village and taken innocent lives. Even though they warned her, Clare's curiosity only grew. She knew there was more to the story than just ghost tales and superstitions. Her goal was clear. She would uncover the truth and maybe, by doing so, bring peace to Sister Lucia's troubled spirit. The first person Clare went to see was Father Benedict. She had heard of his strong faith, but soon learned that his connection to the church was more complicated than he let on. When Clare asked about Sister Lucia, Father Benedict's face grew serious. He told her about the nun who had fallen in love with a traveller, the forbidden pact she had made in her desperation, and the curse that had never been broken. Clare listened carefully, feeling a deep sympathy for the soul trapped in the church. She couldn't help but think that the curse wasn't just about Lucia. There was something deeper, and something the villagers were too scared to talk about. Determined to find out the truth, Clare promised to help Lucia, even if it meant facing the darkness herself. Then, Clare spent her first night in Dunsford, and she felt nervous and uneasy because the villagers' warnings about the cursed church, the ghost of Sister Maria, and the terrifying experiences they had faced kept replaying in her mind. Even though she didn't fully believe the stories, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong as the sun began to set. Could the spirits really haunt the place, or were the villagers just scared by old superstitions? One evening, she sat in the church and the soft light of the candles was flickering around her. Then she saw Father Benedict had left, looking worried and leaving Clare alone in the quiet church. She had brought her notebook, recorder, and curiosity, but what she didn't know was that her presence had already awakened the restless spirit of Sister Lucia. As time passed, the air grew colder, and it was much colder than before. Clare pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders and nervously glanced at the stained glass windows, which cast dim and colourful light across the room. The church was eerily quiet, until a sudden knock rang out behind her. Then Clare spun around, and her heart was racing, but there was no one there. She took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself, though her voice seemed small in the empty church. Then she turned back to the altar, but the unease in her stomach only grew stronger. Then she heard it, a soft murmur, and it was barely audible at first, but it grew louder. The voice seemed to call her name and filled with sadness and pain. Clare's breath caught in her throat, and she slowly stood up, and her eyes scanned the pews, the altar, the confessional, but everything was empty. And then she saw it. A shadow moved quickly along the far wall, something tall and thin that didn't belong. The shape flickered and disappeared into the dark, as fast as it had appeared, leaving Clare frozen in place. Her heart raced. "Lucia," she whispered, and she was almost too afraid to say the name out loud. But there was no answer. Only the sound of soft sobbing echoed through the church. Suddenly, a cold breeze tugged at her hair, and Clare realized with a shiver that she wasn't alone. Something was in the church with her. Something was watching her and waiting for her to uncover the truth. But was she ready for what was about to come? The next morning, the village of Dunsford felt even more tense, because news of Clare's investigation into the haunting had spread fast, and the villagers, who once seemed friendly, now kept their distance. Then whispers followed her wherever she went. People gave her nervous looks, hurried away, and avoided eye contact whenever she passed. The fear of the curse had spread through the village, and even those who didn't believe in ghosts couldn't escape the thick tension in the air. Clare tried to talk to the villagers, but most were either too scared or unwilling to share their experiences. But she was able to speak with a few who had their own stories to tell. Old Thomas, the blacksmith, was one of them. He was a big man with rough hands and a tough look, but his voice shook when he spoke about the church. He said, "I have heard the screams," his eyes darting nervously. "Not just at night, but in the middle of the day too. The cries come from the walls and from the floor itself. It is like the church is alive and fed on the fear of anyone who stays too long." Then, Clare quickly wrote in her notebook, but her mind was racing because the more she listened to the villagers, the heavier their fear seemed to feel. Next, she met Aveline, the herbalist, who didn't believe in ghosts at all. She said it is all in their heads, waving it off. The body can cause anxiety and make people see things that aren't there. The ghosts are just the village's imagination running wild. But as Clare listened to Aveline, she couldn't help but wonder, could the curse really just be a trick of the mind? Or was there something much darker going on? As evening fell, Clare felt more certain that something dark was inside St. Augustine's church. She had gathered enough information to believe the haunting was real. But as she went to talk to Father Benedict again, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, because the priest had been quiet and uncomfortable, especially when she asked about Sister Lucia. Whenever she mentioned her, he would look away and stay silent. That night, Father Benedict and Clare sat in the candlelit study of the rectory, and the silence was heavy between them. Clare asked him once more about Lucia's past, but he didn't answer. Finally, Father Benedict spoke, and his voice was low and strained. He said, "I knew Lucia long before she became a nun," his face shadowed by painful memories. "We were close, and she was beautiful and full of life. And I loved her, but we both chose different paths. She chose the church, and I chose to stay here." Clare's eyes widened. She hadn't expected him to say this. "But you never told me about this before." Father Benedict looked down at his hands, nervously twisting a gold ring on his finger. "I've carried this guilt for years. I loved her, but I let her go. I thought the vows would protect us from temptation, but in the end, it wasn't the vows that caused her pain. It was me." Clare's mind raced. "Did you ever tell her how you felt? Before she left?" "No," Father Benedict whispered, shaking his head. "I couldn't. I chose the church over her. And when she turned to the traveler, and when she made that pact, I never had a chance to fix things." Clare's heart sank. Father Benedict wasn't just a priest dealing with a curse. He was a man who had failed someone he loved. Was his guilt connected to Lucia's curse? As Clare stood to leave, Father Benedict's words stayed with her. "If you truly want to help her, Clare, you must understand that some things or some sins can never be undone." The next morning, Clare went to see Sister Agnes because she was the oldest nun in the convent. Unlike the others, Sister Agnes had always kept to herself, and she was rarely speaking about the past. But Clare felt that she might know more about the curse than anyone else. She had been at the convent for many years, and Clare believed she held valuable knowledge. Sister Agnes' room was simple, with only a few belongings, but there was something comforting about it. The smell of incense filled the air, and ancient books were scattered around. Then she saw the old nun sitting by a small fire, knitting a shawl with her gnarled hands, but her eyes were still sharp despite her age. "Father Benedict told me a little about Lucia's past," Clare said, as she sat across from the nun. "But there is more I need to know, and it is something about an ancient relic." Sister Agnes stopped knitting, and her hands were frozen in mid-air, and her gaze became intense. Then, her voice grew quiet and serious. "The relic, it is dangerous, child. It is a cursed crucifix, used by Lucia to seal her pact with the darkness. It holds the very soul of the one who made the vow. Clare leaned forward, intrigued despite the fear growing in her chest. What happens if I disturb it? If I try to destroy it? Sistra's expression softened, and she set her knitting aside. You mustn't, Clare. The relic cannot be destroyed. But it can only be removed by someone who truly wants to help Lucia's past, and that person might be you. Clare's heart raced. Could it be true? Was she meant to break the curse and free the spirit trapped in the church? But be warned, Sister Agnes continued, her voice full of warning. Some curses, some pacts, are meant to remain undisturbed. To meddle with them is to invite destruction. Clare sat in silence, feeling the weight of Sister Agnes' words. Should she continue, or was she playing with forces that were far beyond her control? Now, Clare knew what she had to do, and she couldn't let fear stop her anymore. With nothing but her determination, she decided to spend the night in the church, and hoped to make contact with Sister Lucia's restless spirit. The night arrived quickly, and the church's tall shape stood against a dark and moonless sky. Inside, the air felt heavy, as if the walls were watching her every move. Sometimes, Clare could hear the faint rustling of old prayer books, and their pages were turning by themselves. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. As midnight drew near, Clare sat in one of the old pews, and her eyes were constantly shifting to the shadows. She had read about hauntings before, but nothing had prepared her for the cold feeling that crept up her spine now. Then, the candles flickered and went out, leaving her in complete darkness. Then she heard a soft whisper filling the air, and it was a sad sound, like the wind through the trees, but much deeper, filled with sorrow. Lucia. Clare whispered into the dark, and her voice was shaking, because she could feel something cold and powerful around her. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, knocking over a candle on the altar. The flames flickered wildly, but the air remained freezing. And then Clare's breath was visible, and her heart pounded in her chest. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. An outline, a figure, faint and glowing, standing near the altar. It was Lucia, or something that looked like her. She wore a torn habit, and her face was hidden in shadows. But the sadness around her was unmistakable. Then she heard Lucia's voice that was barely a whisper, like dry leaves rustling. You should not have come. Clare's heart raced as the air grew even heavier, and the room was shrinking around her. Then, the figure rushed forward. Clare gasped, but before she could react, the ghost vanished into thin air, leaving her alone in the darkness. Shaken, Clare stood frozen. Her mind screamed for answers, but she couldn't move. Had she really seen Lucia? Or was it just her imagination? The silence that followed felt more terrifying than any noise. The air in the church had changed. Clare could feel it now. An oppressive pressure, as if something else was watching, waiting. Then, suddenly, the doors to the church slammed shut with a deafening crash. One day, Father Lucien from another town's church arrived in the village, just as the tension reached its peak. He was tall and had sharp eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. His presence was strong, but there was something unsettling about him. The villagers looked at him with a mix of fear and respect. Then he said, I have been sent by the church to cleanse this place, his deep voice carrying authority that felt unnatural. Clare watched him from a distance, and she sensed something wrong. She had heard whispers about him, the rumors in the tavern, and the quiet talks in the streets. He had come to rid the village of its curse. But Clare felt he cared more about the power hidden in the church than any holy mission. She felt Father Lucien was nothing like Father Benedict, because there was no kindness or humility in him. His followers gathered around him eagerly, like moths to a flame. He spoke about rituals and exorcisms with such coldness that it seemed he enjoyed the fear in their eyes. The next day, Clare went to confront him. He met her with a cold smile. "I know what you were trying to do, Miss Clare. You think you can save them. You think you can save her." He laughed darkly, "But some curses are better left alone." His words made her skin crawl. Was he threatening her, or was he just warning her? There was something more sinister hidden behind his cold smile. Then he warned, "Stay away from the church. The curse is mine to control now." Clare stood in the churchyard and stared at him as he walked into the church. His words weighed heavily on her, but something didn't feel right, because there was something off about Father Lucien. As night fell, Clare couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The village felt heavier than ever, like it was holding its breath and waiting for something terrible to happen. But what exactly was Father Lucien hiding? The next morning, Clare went to the church archives. The dusty shelves were full of old books, records of long-forgotten parishioners, and stories of strange events in the village. As she went through the pages, something caught her eye. An old letter, yellowed with age, fell from between two books. It was addressed to a Father Lucien, even though the signature was too blurry to read. The letter spoke of secret rituals and forbidden knowledge, rituals that promised to control dark forces. Her heart raced. Could this be the same Father Lucien who had come to cleanse the village? It seemed too much of a coincidence. The letter mentioned dark pacts, ancient curses, and the manipulation of souls. The handwriting looked familiar, almost like it had been written by someone involved with the curse haunting the church. As Clare read the letter, she suddenly felt a cold chill on the back of her neck. She turned around, but no one was there. But something moved in the corner of the room, just a shadow. Then her heart skipped a beat, but when she looked again, there was nothing. Then she heard a whisper, and it was so quiet that she almost didn't hear it. "Leave this place now." Then Clare turned quickly and her breath was catching in her throat. Was it Lucia? Or had Father Lucien caught her snooping? Her mind raced as she saw the shadow of Father Lucien standing in the doorway. His eyes locked onto hers, and the smile never left his face. "You are digging into things you don't understand, Clare. You should stop." Fear tightened in her chest. He knew everything, and worse, he had been watching her all along. But what was he really after? One day, Father Benedict had brought Clare to a small and secret room beneath the church. The walls were lined with old books, and their pages were stained by time. But the crucifix on the altar was the only thing that caught Clare's attention. It looked ordinary at first, but the closer she got, the colder the air became. Father Benedict whispered, "This is the cursed crucifix." His voice was shaking. It was part of Sister Maria's pact, because she used it to bind herself to the darkness. Her soul, and anyone who gets too close, will be chained to the curse forever. Then, Clare's fingers lightly touched the relic, but she quickly pulled them back because a sharp pain shot through her fingertips, and the air thickened. Then shadows in the room grew longer and twisted in strange ways. But the relic seemed to pulse with a dark and hungry force, pulling Clare closer. Clare whispered, "I have to destroy it." But how? She had no idea where to start. Father Benedict sighed deeply, and his eyes were fixed on the crucifix. Then he said, "The only way to destroy it is through an ancient ritual. A ritual that needs the sacrifice of someone connected to Lucia, someone who understands her pain." But the cost, he trailed off, and he was unable to say more. Clare's heart skipped a beat. Could she be the one? And could she end Lucia's suffering? Suddenly, the temperature dropped and Clare's breath turned to mist in the freezing air. The room felt heavier, as though something beyond her understanding was closing in on her. Then, the shadows twisted and writhed, as if they were alive. From the corner of her eye, she saw a tall and thin figure dressed in dark robes. Clare whispered Lucia. Then the figure flickered and vanished, leaving only a deep sense of fear. Father Benedict stepped closer to her, and his face was pale. "This isn't just a relic," he murmured. "It is a prison, and Lucia's prison." Before Clare could respond, a loud crash echoed through the church, followed by hurried footsteps. Someone was coming. The darkness was closing in. And then Clare knew there was no turning back. Now the village had been tense 4 weeks, and it was about to explode. Father Lucien's sermons had become fiercer and more frantic. His voice, once calm and welcoming, now sounded like a growl, full of anger and urgency. He told the villagers that the curse was back and it was stronger than before, and he blamed Clare for all the bad things that had happened since she arrived. The villagers believed him because he was their leader, and they trusted him completely. In the narrow village streets, whispers turned into shouts. They yelled it is because of her, and their eyes were full of fear and rage. She's the reason we suffer, and we must get rid of her. Then, Father Lucien led a growing mob, and his face was twisted in fury, and his eyes were burning with fanatical energy. He shouted, "She brought the curse back. She must pay for what she's done to us." Then, the crowd, driven by fear and panic, moved toward Clare's house. The once quiet village was now full of noise and tension as people shouted and waved their fists. Clare heard the mob before she saw them, the loud stomping of boots and the angry cries of the crowd. She stepped outside and saw them coming. The heavy weight of the relic around her neck felt suffocating. Her heart sank when she realized the mob was coming for her. Then, someone yelled from the front, "Leave the village, witch, you are the cause of our pain." Father Lucien's voice cut through the chaos. "She must be cast out. She has made the curse worse because she is working with dark forces." Clare's heart raced, and she knew she had to act fast. But it was too late. Lucien's eyes locked onto hers, cold and filled with hate. He said, "You won't leave this village alive." Before Clare could react, the mob pushed forward, reaching out for her and trying to drag her toward the church. She struggled, but there were too many of them. They were desperate and believed she was the source of all their misery, and they would do anything to stop her. But with a surge of adrenaline, Clare managed to break free. She ran, and her feet were barely touching the ground, and headed into the forest. Her breath was quick and shallow, and her heart was pounding in her chest. She couldn't stay, not now. The curse was almost ready to break. But if Lucien got control of the relic, everything would be lost, and she had to stop him. The wind whipped through her hair as she ran deeper into the trees, the darkness of the forest swallowing her whole. She had to act quickly, because the village was on the brink of collapse, and only she could save them. But even as she ran, she could still hear Father Lucien's voice, in the distance, full of rage and hatred. The curse wasn't just about darkness, it was about control, and Lucien wasn't going to let it slip away. Then, Clare stumbled into the quiet library, and her mind was spinning with everything that had happened. Now she had barely escaped the mob, but she knew time was running out. She had to find a way to break the curse and understand the darkness that Father Lucien was trying to control. The relic was important, but it wasn't enough on its own. Her fingers brushed over the dusty shelves as she searched for something that might help. Then, something caught her eye. A worn leather diary, its pages yellowed with age. She pulled it down, and her hands were shaking, and carefully opened it. Then she saw it was Lucia's diary. As Clare read, she learned about a forbidden love, Lucia's deep feelings for a man who promised her a future, but betrayed her in the worst way. The story was heartbreaking, because Lucia had given everything to him, and when she found herself pregnant, he abandoned her and left her alone to face the world in the village. But in the last pages, Clare found something else. Something that made her heart race. Lucia's love had been her hope, and the pain of losing that love had created the curse. But there was a way to end it. Lucia's spirit could find peace if her love was returned. The only way to do that was to bring the lost love back together. Clare closed the diary and her breath was catching, because this was her chance. She had to find the lost love, that Lucia's soul wouldn't rest until the truth was revealed. As Clare stood up, she heard a soft voice behind her. Father Benedict stepped out of the shadows, and his face was filled with regret. He said, "I have been waiting for you." Then Father Benedict sighed deeply and confessed his role in Maria's heartbreak, because he had been the one to counsel the man who abandoned her, believing he was doing the right thing. The guilt had eaten at him for years, and now he wanted to make it right. He said, "I can help you," his eyes full of hope. "Together, we can end this curse." Clare nodded and understood the weight of the task ahead. But as they moved toward the church, the storm clouds gathered once more because time was running out. The darkness in the church grew thicker as Clare and Father Benedict approached, and the air was heavy with a sense of doom. When they entered the church, Father Lucien stood at the altar, and the relic was resting on a stone pedestal in front of him. The candlelight flickered and cast shadows across his face, which looked cold and determined. He said, "You have come to stop me." His voice was low and mocking. Clare's heart raced as she stepped forward, but Father Benedict placed a hand on her arm and stopped her. "Lucien, it is over, and we know the truth now. This relic isn't for power. It is a curse and a trap." Lucien smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Power," he repeated. "This isn't about power. It's about salvation. Don't you see? Lucia's curse is a gift that will give me control of this village. Now I will lead them and shape their future." Father Benedict recoiled in disgust. "You have given yourself to dark forces. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Then Lucien laughed, and the sound echoed in the empty church. "Oh, I know exactly what I am doing, and it is you who don't understand. The curse has always been a tool, and I will use it to save the village from their suffering. But you are just a weak fool trying to stop it." Then the tension in the room thickened, and Clare felt the shadows grow stronger. The relic's power responded to Lucien's dark words, pulsing like a living thing. The air felt thick, like the church itself was closing in on them and filled with an evil presence. Then Father Benedict stepped forward and stood in front of Clare to protect her. "We will stop you. We will end this curse and save this village, no matter what it takes." Suddenly, Lucien's eyes turned dark, and his hands rose as if to summon something unseen. "Then prepare to face the consequences." Suddenly, Clare's heart raced, and for a moment, everything in the church seemed to stop, like the world was holding its breath. Then, a cold wind swept through the room, blowing out the candles and plunging them into darkness. Suddenly, Lucia's voice broke the silence, soft, sad, and full of pain. "You have come so far, Clare, but the darkness still holds. You all, and there is only one way to break the curse." Clare's eyes searched the church and tried to find where the voice was coming from, but there was no one there. The church was empty, except for her, Father Benedict, and Lucien. But Lucia's presence filled the space, cold and ghostly, sending a chill down Clare's spine. Then Lucia continued, "I am trapped here by the choices made long ago." Her voice was fading in and out like a breeze. "But there is hope, and you must destroy the relic. Only then will my spirit be free. But be careful, the relic is not easily destroyed, and neither is Lucien." Clare's body trembled as the meaning of Lucia's words sank in. The relic was not just a curse. It was a prison that kept Lucia's soul trapped. If they destroyed it, they could break the curse and set Lucia free, but at what cost? Before Clare could say anything, Lucia's voice faded away, leaving only silence. Then she saw Father Benedict's face was pale, and he said we must act now. Lucien is beyond saving and the relic must be destroyed. Then Clare nodded with fear rising in her chest. This was it, and they had to do it now. But as she turned to face Lucien, doubt crept into her mind. Could they really defeat him? And could they truly break the curse? But Lucia's warning echoed in her head, giving her the strength to move forward. They had no choice but to try. Then, the church shook as Father Lucien raised his hands high, and the shadows around them twisted like they were alive. The relic glowed with a creepy green light and pulsing from its center. Then, Clare's heart pounded in her chest as Father Benedict stepped forward and held up his crucifix to fight the dark magic. Then Father Benedict shouted, "Lucien, you have been tricked. This isn't the way, because the curse will destroy everything you love." Lucien's face twisted into a sneer and filled with anger. "You have no power here, old man. I have chosen the darkness, and there's no turning back now." Then, the room seemed to change as the walls pulsed with dark energy. The church groaned and shook under Lucien's power. Shadows jumped from the corners, reaching out for Clare and Father Benedict. Then, ghostly figures appeared, and their faces were full of pain, and reached for salvation that would never come. Suddenly Clare's blood ran cold as she understood the true horror they were facing. This wasn't just a battle for the village, it was a battle for their very souls. Then, Father Benedict began to pray for protection and moved toward Lucien. But before he could reach him, Lucien fired a bolt of dark energy, knocking Father Benedict across the room. Then he collapsed and twitched, as if he were about to die. Clare's heart raced as she rushed to his side, but Father Benedict weakly stopped her. "Go, Clare, destroy the relic, because it is the only way." With determination, Clare stood up and her eyes focused on Lucien, because the relic glowed brighter in his hands and the curse's power, growing stronger with every beat of his heart. Then Lucien hissed, "I won't let you destroy everything," his eyes wild with madness. Clare stepped forward and her fingers were brushing the relic. Then the room shook, as if the church itself was alive. She began to speak the incantation and her voice was trembling but steady, calling on Lucia's love and forgiveness. Lucien screamed as the relic began to crack. The dark magic fought to keep its power, but Clare didn't stop. She poured everything into the incantation, her heart and soul joining with Maria's spirit. Finally, with a loud crack, the relic shattered. The dark magic that had consumed the church seemed to disappear, and the heavy air lightened. Then, Father Lucien's body collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, the church was quiet, with only the soft sound of the wind outside. With the relic broken, the curse that had haunted the village for so long began to fade. The heavy darkness in the church lifted, and the soft light of dawn streamed through the stained glass windows. Suddenly, Lucia's spirit appeared before Clare and her face was calm and peaceful. Then Lucia whispered thank you, her voice full of gratitude. "You have freed me, and the village." Clare felt a deep sense of relief as the curse finally ended. The villagers' suffering was over, but it had come at a great cost. The church was now restored to its old beauty, but Father Benedict lay unconscious, and his body was weak from the battle. Now Lucien, consumed by the darkness he had tried to control, was gone. His body had vanished and turned into the very shadows he had used for so long. Then, Clare stood in the quiet and Lucia's spirit smiled gently at her. "You have saved us all," she said. "But remember, love and faith can defeat even the darkest curses." As the village slowly returned to normal, the scars of the curse began to heal. The once damaged church was now a place of peace, and its doors opened to everyone. The villagers, though still cautious, began to rebuild, their hearts lighter without the fear that had weighed them down. Clare sat in the restored church, thinking about everything that had happened. The journey had been hard, full of darkness and fear. but she had found strength in Lucia's story and in the love that had saved them all. Now the village was free, and the curse had been broken. Father Benedict, though still weak from the battle, found peace in the forgiveness he had received. He had done his part, and now he could help guide the village to a brighter future. Sister Agnes, who had supported them through it all, began preparing the church for the future and working with the villagers to rebuild what had been lost. As Clare prepared to leave, she found a letter left behind by Lucia. It was simple, but its words carried the weight of the past and the hope for the future. Love and faith are powerful enough to overcome even the darkest curses. Remember us, and let our story live on. Clare smiled and knew that the village would be reborn, stronger and freer than ever before. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks,